Well, after a long, long grind, I am back in GM finally. Uh-oh, where's the update? Oh, there it is. They debated me for a little bit there. So it's been a little while, but I am back in GM. A little bit of a struggle, but we got there eventually. And, so I just wanted to share that first. But in case you missed it, I feel like I kind of buried the lead with the last video in the sense that we went through the entire engagement optimized matchmaking paper. And obviously, I kind of went into it blind, but I learned a ton from it. And what I realized is that the whole study is kind of a sham. And so I want to open that up really quickly and take a look at it with you guys and just really briefly cover the main points, because I think a lot of people aren't going to sit through, the huge 2-hour video to get to the conclusion. So let me just pull up the study really quickly. Okay, so we have it here, back to it. And what we can see is basically you've got this study that was in 2016. They tested it on an EA game, and later on in the paper, they mentioned that one of the things that they were looking at was goals. So I'm assuming that this is FIFA back in 2016. And so obviously it's somewhat of a new concept. I mean, that is 8 years ago, but in terms of how fast these things move, that is fairly new. And so maybe more research has been done since then. We would want to, consider that and look into that. But for the most part, what I found is that the study has some really troubling problems, and I pointed a bunch out, but I actually want to talk about the main one that I think is really killer for the whole theory, and I think a good reason to not actually worry too much about engagement optimized matchmaking. One thing that I found really weird was that they should just be able to calculate mathematically like the number of players that would quit on average, or what they're calling in this study like the churn risk. They should just be able to calculate that, but instead they opted to do a simulation. And the problem with doing a simulation is that you can get different results different times that you run the simulation. So just because one thing has slightly higher odds of happening doesn't mean that you can't run the simulation and then publish the simulation that gave you the results that you wanted. So especially when you have very close results, it seems a little bit weird to rely on a simulation like this, because you could run the exact same simulation again and get completely different results, showing that actually there's no benefit. And so we have very close numbers. But essentially what they found, according to their own admission, is that they tested a pool of P players of only 100, 200, 300, 400, and 500 players. And I think this is the main problem. How can you test and run your simulation on only up to 500 players when games like even FIFA, but especially competitive games that might look at this like League or, CSGO or other ones like Overwatch and things like that, or similar games to that will come up in the future, that are thinking about, do we want to have a skill-based matchmaking system, or do we want to go with engagement optimized matchmaking to try to make more money? I don't actually even think that engagement optimized matchmaking works according to this study or makes more money. And the reason why is because they say that they only tested up to 500 players, which doesn't really make sense, because again, you'd really want to test it on many more players. You'd want to test it on 10,000 players and maybe 100 to 500 games, not 100 to 500 players and 10,000 games. This just doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me. But anyways, one of the things that we can see here from this is that the benefit is very small, because actually skill-based matchmaking won in the pool of 100 players. It actually retained players better than engagement optimized matchmaking. And then you can see that the one that performed the best was actually engagement optimized matchmaking, but only by a tiny, tiny portion. They admit themselves right here that they only retain 0.7% more players compared with skill-based matchmaking. And I don't think that that's very high. And I mean, we could add these up, but the whole point is this is supposed to be a shorter one. I don't even know that the 0.7% is true. So let's just fact check that really quickly, because in rounds 1, 2, 3, 4, they had 0. 0.3, 0.9, 1.1, and 0.6, but they didn't include round 1. Yeah, they actually even kind of fudged this number a little bit, because they retain 0.7% more players compared to skilled matchmaking. But actually, this is only looking at the 4 groups that they won. This is only looking at 200, 300, 400, and 500 players, where engagement optimized matchmaking outperformed a little bit. So they're actually ignoring, the negative result, which should bring this average down lower, that they got from the pool of 100 players that skilled matchmaking actually won in their own simulation, which again was kind of a weird simulation, only testing 500 players. And then potentially, of course, you can just run the simulation as many times as you want until you get a slightly favorable result. But really, I think the nail in the coffin is this sentence here, where it says that this may suggest that when the player pool reaches a certain size, the choices of opponents are enough to rescue those players on the edge of churn. Beyond this size, meaning a size of only 500 players, a larger player pool may not bring in significantly extra benefits in engagement maximization. So as far as I can tell, even the original paper that put forth engagement optimized matchmaking is admitting that it doesn't necessarily even have any benefit on a player pool above 500, which is really, really strange to me, because most of these games are going to have a player pool in ranked of more than 500. So this seems to me to be we've gone all blurry. Hello? This seems to me to be a really, just kind of a scuffed study. It's one of those studies where you've really tried to force your conclusion, and there were many more aspects to the study when we went through the whole thing that were wrong, but this is just the main one. The study only tests up to a player pool of 500 and then says that it's not much better than other forms of matchmaking above 500, and they did a simulation so that they could get different results. I mean, sometimes you even have random matchmaking performing better than skilled matchmaking at player engagement, and it goes back and forth with no consistent pattern. And the reason why it's going back and forth and not conclusively showing that skilled matchmaking is always better than random matchmaking, or random matchmaking is always better than skilled, is because it's a simulation, and so you're going to get very, very strange, weird results. I mean, you can even look at like what the actual numbers are saying, because they've ran so many rounds of matchmaking. This is just so weird, because what they're saying is they started out with 200 players and now they have 103 players left. But even the initial numbers that they're basing this off of, like what they initially said the churn rates are, this won't work the same way for players who are playing 10,000 matches. Like, those players aren't like likely to quit. You're not going to see half of them quit. Or maybe it is true that over 10,000 matches you see half of them quit, but 10,000 matches is so many that's like, yeah, they're quitting in like 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years from now. The other big issue with this is, like, what this really ignores is, even if you ignore the fact that they ran this simulation and it doesn't show any efficiency over 500, which is why they didn't include that in the study. Even if you assume that it's actually true and you ignore the first round and you say, okay, you have a 0.7% increase of player retention. If you end up increasing player retention by only 0.7%, but what happens to the other 99% of people who were not having problems with player retention? And now you've gone from a skill-based matchmaking system to an engagement-based matchmaking system. Why would those people not leave? You might see well over 0.7% of players from the pool of 99% of players who aren't churning and leaving the game. You might see way more of those people leave if you switch to a rigged engagement-based system. Even if it's not public, because probably 1% of people will feel that out. There's probably that many people have left League without any proof that that's even the case, and I don't even think it is the case. I don't think that League is running engagement based matchmaking. We can disagree, about that and talk about that, but I mean, that's the interesting thing to me that I pointed out too about this churn risk table is there's a big important number that's just not being talked about here at all, which is that 95 plus, like 95 to 97.5% of the players who were playing FIFA in 2016 were not churning at all, which is actually crazy good. And they defined in this table churning as they're not playing a game within the next week. So that means 95 to 97.5% of people who are playing like ranked FIFA or something like that were playing at least once a week after that. I mean, that is a crazy high percentage. That is already such a good success that you don't want to mess with any underlying system that contributed to that success. So obviously that means you have a good game, you have good matchmaking. So why would you want to go out of your way to spend millions of dollars to redesign the rank system, to completely change your matchmaking system in order to do what? Best case scenario, you get 0.7% more players retained. And if people find out that you've switched to a rigged system and that your game is no longer primarily a skill-based game or something like that, people will quit the game at a higher rate than you retained players by trying to bait them in with engagement optimization by giving them certain patterns of wins and losses. So at the end of the day, I think that this whole study, and you can see more if you want to go watch the 2-hour video on it and where I read through the study. But I think there's so many flaws with this concept in this study. And what's really crazy to me is how many games have actually admitted that they're actually doing this. Now, I know that like League and CSGO and big competitive staple games, aren't doing this. They don't admit that they're doing this. They don't say that they're doing this. But we know of lots of games, especially newer games, that aren't meant to be as competitive that are definitely doing this. EA, lights this concept and things like that, for example. So that's really crazy to me because I don't even think that it's proven to be effective. So this is like one of those things where you go into a meeting, in corporate, and you tell the board at EA that you have this like crazy $1 million idea that's going to make you a huge amount of money. And then you go in and you present them with this study. Nobody actually bothers to read it. Nobody thinks critically about what's in the study and the results. And they eat it up and they say, wow, we're going to make millions of dollars by ruining the matchmaking system. And, they spend a bunch of time and money revamping the whole thing. And then it probably doesn't even increase player retention at all. So the whole thing's just nuts. So congrats to me for getting GM. League is skill-based because I am GM. So that's all that there is to it, right? Boosting wouldn't work. We talked about this. Boosting wouldn't work. High elo players wouldn't be able to go onto low rank accounts and consistently climb with them. And, on the flip side, low ranking players wouldn't be able to get on high rank accounts that they buy in Masters and lose all of the games that they play with me and tilt me. So, it is what it is. Somebody mentioned a really good point though, which is that, what if they just used engagement optimized matchmaking on a small pool of players, especially because it seems weird that they focused on studying such a small pool of players. So what if they took whales, because whales are, by definition, you're going to have, the top 1% of spenders on any game, whether it's CSGO or League. The top 1% of spenders are going to be the type of people who are going out and buying like almost all of the skins. They're like collectors. They want to have all the stuff. And these guys have a ton of money that they're spending on this stuff. And Riot could very easily identify like who is a whale and who isn't, and then only give them the engagement-based matchmaking experience, like a little bit of a spending boost. And of course, that's, kind of just a theory or like a conspiracy theory that people came up with. But it's an interesting one, and there's not really a good way to like prove it or disprove it, because obviously their spending data isn't public. And, you're going to have a hard time. Like I said, people would notice if you had a widespread engagement-based matchmaking system. But if you don't have it widespread, if you just target specific pools of players, like people who spend the most money, then it could be a problem. But anyways, I don't know. So good luck in solo queue and have a wonderful day.